Well, welcome. My name's Todd Wilson. I'm one of the facilitators in the Multipliers Pathway process. And today we are going to be doing a flyover of what it looks like to get involved in church planting. This video is aimed directly at churches that would like to get involved in church planting but haven't been, or for leaders who want to get involved in church planting. This is going to be a conversation today where we're going to kind of treat it like some FAQs. And joining me today are Patrick Bradley from Passion for Planting and Chris Pasik from the Unite Community Church in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, you guys have a bunch of experience in church planting. Let's just start there. Patrick, why don't you give us a brief introduction of the front row seat you've had to church planting for the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's been my pleasure to be able to serve church planters full time since the end of 2007. And I have about a dozen years with Passion for Planting. And Passion for Planting is the church planting ministry of New Life Christian Church, which is a local congregation that's gotten involved in church planting. Over those all these years, I've personally done project management for, I'll say well over 100 church planters, walking with them for 9 months, seeing all the details. And now as director of operations, I oversee the other things that we do, assessment and residency and those kinds of things. So yeah, in New Life's family tree, through Passion for Planting's efforts, we have over 325 churches that we can count, if you count generationally down. So it's more than I could have asked or imagined when I started this journey.
Chris.
Yeah, my name is Chris Pasik. I started my church plant journey in 2018 with these guys, Passion for Planting. I learned a ton. But if you do the math, we had to live through COVID. And so my church planting experience was starting 18, and then we had to reinvent ourselves during COVID, and then coming out of COVID, reinvent ourselves again. So I feel like for me, we haven't just planted one church, but we've kind of had to reinvent ourselves. And I feel like we finally are settling in, even though it feels like a third time over. But the bottom line is we've been at it for 6 years. Man, because of the education, because of the churches, local churches that have supported us, continue to support us, we're able to continue moving forward and see the gospel, where we've baptized in 6 years through COVID over 150 people. And so it's been really amazing as we've made our journey to just help people discover and love who Jesus is.
Well, I want to thank you guys for joining us today. There's a whole lot of questions we could pose that, sort of the top questions that churches have that are looking at getting involved. I really want to be razor focused that there's a growing number of churches that have never been involved in church planting who are starting to see that they want to get involved in church planting. And I'd like to target our conversations directly to that audience as we go through today. And so we're going to walk through a series of questions that are just, what are the most frequent things people are thinking about. We're calling this Church Planting 101 because we're not going to try to do a deep dive into lots of details of things. We're going to do the flyover of the most common questions. I think the appropriate place for us to start is really this most basic question, checking our motives. Why do we want to plant a church? Why should we plant churches? And Chris, given that you had to go through the journey of working your way through calling, and I think it's safe to say planting a church is probably one of the hardest things you've ever done in your life, with more spiritual warfare than anything you've done in your life. So it's not for the faint of heart. So amidst something that's the hardest thing you've ever done, share with us your heart and give us some inspiration on why plant churches.
Yeah, so from a church planter perspective, number one foundation is Jesus says, go into all the world, making disciples. And I'm telling you, the church is the vessel that allows that to happen. I mean, again, for me, we've seen that firsthand. I've done lots of things, bands, going to bars to play music, to share the gospel, do ministry on college campuses. But I'm telling you, nothing quite cuts through community like the church does. And so, one, Jesus says to go. And then what I've learned along the way is a couple of things that what church planting does that man just is so amazing that an established church, I'm not 100% can do as effective, right? Where number one is it reaches unreached people. There are so many people that came through our doors because they had never been to a church, and why they picked our church, a brand new church they'd never heard of, is because they didn't feel qualified. And they were like, well, if we're going to start a new journey with God, then we want to start at a new church. And so they weren't looking for the established church. They were looking for ours, right? And so it was awesome to watch all these non-believers, non-church people come in. And again, that was a phenomenal thing. Secondly, is it allows guys like me to be able to have a voice in the church, right? So lots of churches are looking for the next generation, right, to lead in their churches. But it's really difficult because them guys like me come in like a battering ram with vision. And we break a lot of the established churches. Like what makes that, like your church yours, is your vision. And we need to give space for guys like me to be sent out into creating what God has called us to do. So I think one, Gia said it, two, is it reaches a brand new demographic, creates a brand new movement of God in the area. And then three, it allows space for brand new visionary pastors to rise and fall, right? Because some of the things I've done in 6 years, it was like, man, if I'd have done that at my 1,000-person church, we'd have broke a lot of things and hurt a lot of people, right? But we were nimble enough to learn and grow and then also be mentored by those bigger churches. So for me, those are a couple of the reasons I think that you guys should jump right in. There's nothing quite like planting a church.
That's fantastic, Chris. I think you've really hit on some of the very inspirational parts of it, of how we can be more effective in doing church. I think one of the pragmatic things to highlight here is, we're 2,000 years into this thing called the church that Jesus started. And arguably, there's really not many local churches still around today. Some would argue none that were around 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
In fact, each of us trace our spiritual lineage through disciples who make disciples, churches planting churches. So there's actually a very pragmatic, the bridge to the future is the same bridge that's the bridge to the past, which is churches that plant churches that plant churches. And so I think there's a very practical part to the equation too. Patrick, I want to, for this next question, let's just say in the metaphor of cooking that what we've just decided to bake is a church plant and start a new church. And we're going to put the ingredients out there of what the ingredients are, basically, that have to come together for this thing called a church plant. So talk to us for a few minutes about what are the basic ingredients? What are the non-negotiables for a church that hasn't been involved in church planting yet? What are the things they've got to make sure come together and happen to start or to bake this thing called a church plant that we're going to do?
Yeah, the main ingredients, we'll try to boil it down to the key components. And the one would be the planter. Who's going to lead this new work? You got to know who the person is and find them, raise them up. But a lot rises and falls on that leader. The next is the place. Where's the church plant going to be? It's going to be the same community, the next community over, across the country. But thinking through, what's the target community? What's it like? How do we get the gospel in there? The third thing would be a plan. There's lots of different ways to go about church planting, 31 flavors, if you will. But each specific church planter needs to figure out, all right, well, I'm not just going to wing it. What am I going to do specifically? Like what's appropriate for me in this time, in this community, and put that all together into a plan. Of course, money. There's got to be provision, whether that's a little or a lot, depending on lots of different factors, model, local cost of living. There's lots of things that play into that, but probably there's some resources that are needed. And so that's going to be a key component. And then the fifth that I would throw out is accountability. which sometimes gets overlooked, but having some support structures around the church planter, like who's going to lead the planter and ask them the hard questions and call to challenge them to be the best version of themselves and really do the hard work and be out there meeting the people and telling people about Jesus. So planter, place, plan, provision, if I can alliterate, and then I ran out of P's. Last one, accountability.
Either one of you can jump in on this follow-up question to that. It would be very easy. I'm trying to put myself in the position of I'm a church that wants to get involved in planting and I've not done it before. That list even feels a little overwhelming. I've got to go find a planter. I've got to pick a place. I've got to put a plan together. I got to go find all the money, and I got to figure out how to provide accountability over something I've never done before. So talk to us a little bit about how do you overcome, all those things really required by one church that's never planted a church before, or how does this actually come together?
Yep, I'll start by saying there's lots of help that's out there. We'll get into that a little more, I think, with some of the other FAQs that are coming up. But like Pastor for Planting as a ministry of New Life is really born out of that question. It's like we keep helping church planners. We keep doing the same things over and over. We should write some of this stuff down and make it available to help others. So we're not the only ones. There's lots of networks and groups that are out there doing that kind of thing. So take heart. You don't have to invent all of this stuff from scratch. There's lots of helps to get to the 20-yard line in this whole church planting journey.
Chris, anything else on that?
Yeah, I mean, to a church that wants to jump involved, I mean, just reach out. I think, like I said, for me, I came from a church that had no history in church planting. And so my church actually partnered with another church, and it became a collaborative effort, which then we found passion for planting. And then through that network, there's multiple other networks that came through. And all of a sudden, for me, we started a little network of pastors in my area, all planting with different organizations. And we all were able to come together, and churches were learning from other churches. And it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so I think if you just were to take your first step of discovery, God seems to take care of the rest, because I really think you say yes to this, God opens it.
I want to stick on this just for a minute. So the over 300 and some church plants in the lineage that you've been involved in, is it safe to say that church plants really only happen in one of three ways? There's an individual planter like Chris or someone in that category that goes off totally by themselves. They have no parent church. They have no collaborative. They try to go do it by themselves. And I think we would always say foolish is foolish is foolish. Like, that category is not a real smart thing to go do. There's a second category, which would be a church that decides to do it by themselves, parent the church, and when they have the money and find the planter and have the place, the church does it by themselves. And we do see a lot of that happening. And then there's a third, which is a collaborative of churches that come together, what Chris is referring to. What's your advice on that scenario? I mean, somebody who's never been involved in planting before,
Okay.
do you have a bias to the collaborative path for them?
Absolutely. Because here's what we've seen is even if a church has enough the resources and critical mass to do the planting themselves, if they will share that responsibility, invite other churches in, maybe that are checking it out for the first time, they can take the lead and invite others to get a front row seat and activate other churches to church planting through a collaboration. And so, yeah, there's just some beautiful things that have come out of that. There are churches that are planting now that thought, where do I even start? But because they came alongside, like what Chris was just describing, like, let's join forces and we'll learn from the more experienced ones, and we'll invite others that are less experienced in our footsteps, and we can all make progress together. So more than one way to go about this getting started. And man, if you can collaborate in a family of churches, put together a collaborative network, there's lots of ways that looks like, but we're better together.
Great. Well, so in summary, the ingredients that have to come together, you've got the planter, the place, the plan, the provision or money, and then some accountability. Let's move on to the next question that plays off of that then. So if there is a church or a collaborative churches that are going to go ahead and jump into that, they're going to get going on planting a church. What are the key questions that they ought to be thinking about or needing to answer when they're planting? Not necessarily prerequisites to getting started, but what are the kinds of key questions? Some things are more important than others. Like they're not going to start with, oh, what's the logo going to look like on the new church plant? There's some higher level things to jump into first. So either one of you jump in, talk to us about what these key questions are that church.
Yeah, these are important enough decisions or questions to wrestle with that Chris and I brainstormed a list, and so we'll kind of tag team back and forth. But I'll start off with, for the church planting church, why are we planting? Check your motives. I mean, we talked about that a little on the front end. The church planter themselves has to figure that out, but also the church planting church, like, why?
Yeah, and then a big question that you're going to then have to answer, who are the partners and who's going to all get in the pool together? And again, that was a big question for me, especially on my church planting journey, because you start wrestling with theology, what makes a biblical church. And so you really want to make sure that that becomes crystal clear. And then I think once you kind of have the why, kind of get some partners. Again, another question that was really big to us was the when and the where. Right? So again, if you're going to have multiple churches helping you, you don't want to create a competition, right? Where one church feels like you're stealing people, right? But they also might go, well, we want to actually send people, right? There's a unique church in Ann Arbor right now that they're completely built out, completely landlocked. And their pastor's talking to me going, we're never going to get bigger than 1,000. Therefore, we need to plant churches. And so he approaches me because he's like, you're a church planter. Let's go. How do we learn? Where do I go? So the when and where is so important, especially with the partners.
Yeah, as you're figuring out the when and the where and these other things, a next big question to wrestle with is what model will we use? I referenced earlier 31 flavors of church planting, and it's exciting to see the models proliferate. But there's not just one way to plant a church. There's lots of considerations, and they get different names and labels. Launch large or prevailing model. There's house church. There's missional communities. I mean, there's lots of even buzzwords around that. But taking a look at what's going to be appropriate for this planter, what are his leadership strengths, and what does the community need, and what do our resources allow? There's its own stew in all of that will speak into here's the model that we're going to use to make disciples that will lead to planting this church that will plant more churches.
Yeah. Let me piggyback on that too, because I would say once you identify the planter, allow the planter to dig into what they want to do, not stick to whatever model your church came from. You know what I mean? That's so important. Again, you can disagree with it, but if he's got a good plan, again, the partners, the when, the where, let the model happen. And then I think what starts to help the model shape is then you got to ask, well, what's the cost? 6 years ago, we raised $256,000 6 years ago, which may as well have been $1 million to me because it was all just such big numbers. And I remember Patrick like, oh, we're running behind. We're not hitting our benchmarks, but when you have that accountability, cost becomes real, and a lot of planters, again, are afraid of those numbers. So the cost, how much it will cost is a really key question to ask.
Another key decision or question to wrestle with is, who will the planter be? Maybe in your situation where you have several potential candidates that have been emerging within your congregation and, prayerfully discerning who that might be. For a lot of congregations and church planting networks, they're asking, where do we find the next church planter? Where do we find the next church planter for a lot of years, there's been a sort of prevailing free agency model. And I think a lot of us are realizing, yeah, we need to go back to a farm system model and grow church planters from within. That's not the only way to do it. Those are both great ways to find a church planter. But who will your planter be? Can you bias towards raising somebody up from within your own congregation? If not, who do you know that could come to the target community and plant with?
Yeah. Yeah. And then with that, when you find that person, I think a great question for your church to ask is, how will you support and equip the planter? And again, from me, like most likely you're going to sit down with someone with a lot of vision and they're going to draw up Disneyland, and it's going to be sort of insulting because it'll be like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do it the right way, insinuating you're the parent church doing it wrong. and then, the longer you get into things, you just kind of giggle because you want them to fly, and they got to learn, right? So the question becomes is, how are you going to support them when they fail? How are you going to support them, if they fly up to success, right? How are you going to equip them, to continue to learn and grow, so they don't fall off the tracks? Again, like Todd said, planning a church, honestly, has been the greatest joy in my life, but has brought the most tears ever, right? And so if I can honestly say, if it wasn't for the men in my life that I've been able to call, that I've been able to cry with, that I've been able to say, I need, right? Like one Sunday, like all the musicians were sick all at once, and we only had 3 to begin with. So it wasn't a lot, but we had no music. It was like, we'll play a CD or I called my buddy. I was like, do you just have a girl that can sing? I can play acoustic guitar. And he was like, actually, I have a guy, an extra worship leader that can play guitar and just come lead for you. And so literally they just diverted their whole worship set to give us their worship leader. And they ran their whole church with volunteers, gave us their paid guy, right? But those moments created a bond and a support that was so beyond anything, because when you're planting, and so those are key questions for you to be asking.
Yeah, and in the support in the equip realm for supporting and equipping the church planter, there's some things that need to be done in-house or can't be farmed out, or at least are very relational, like that mentoring kind of thing, and just the relational connection, the family aspect. And there are some things that require a little more expertise that maybe doesn't already exist in your congregation or even in your family of churches. And so there are those out there that can be engaged to bring that expertise and help you out so you don't have to figure out everything for yourself. Last thing that's super important to wrestle through is, how will you build in accountability for the church planter? This gets overlooked quite a bit in the church planting world as we talk to church planters here and there. It's like, hey, what's your accountability look like, or who are you accountable to? And it's just such an important structure component, something to figure out. Don't leave the church planter out there completely maverick, without oversight, without accountability, without leadership. As the Roman centurion said to Jesus, I also am a man under authority. And so having that, even a temporary structure in our ecosystem, it often looks like a temporary elder board or sort of a management team that's outside church planters or pastors and leaders from other churches that are external to the church plant, but have something in place where the church planter knows that somebody is watching to help, but that they're watching and they have to give an account, like, all right, so you were given 5 talents, you were given 2 talents, you were given 1 talent. What did you do with it? Accountability is key to have in place to support the church planter in a healthy way.
Patrick, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record from the last question, but it would be very easy. That's a lot of tough questions to answer. Like, those are not, for the faint of heart, for people that have never planted churches before. So I assume this pushes right back to pick up the phone, get help, do it collaboratively. I think one of the things that we definitely need to highlight is church planting in the U.S. right now has become a bit of a mature, I'm even going to say industry at this point. there's been a lot of it happening. You've got a lot of different service providers, a lot of expertise, but the scope of even those types of questions, I'm assuming you would recommend. That's why when you're jumping in the first time, it's a good thing to do it with somebody and get the right help.
Yeah, even as a disciple should be discipling someone else, congregations can disciple or mentor other congregations in how to do church planting. So there are churches out there that want to help. There are church networks, ministry like Pastor for Planning that want to help. And so the help is out there for the asking. So be encouraged that you don't have to figure all this stuff out and create everything from scratch.
Great. We're going to move on to our next question. I know that there's probably a bunch of, I'm going to say, engineers amongst these churches, maybe some elders that are listening in on this that are wanting you to answer the question, what's the overall process look like? Like, what are the phases of planting? If you were sort of putting this onto a Gantt chart with the high level phases, the planters are going to have an affinity to the phase that launches the church. Let's get this church launched. And yet there's a bunch of other phases that have to all happen to get to the point of launching the church. So if you guys would address what's the overall, just give us the basic expectation of laying out what phases or overall parts of the process to plant the church.
Yeah, let me give the skeleton. And Chris, I'd love to hear your experience of what that was like when you were planting. So broad strokes that the church planting church needs to prepare, some of these things that we've been talking about, wrestling through these decisions. We believe that things reproduce after their own kind. And so churches should plant churches primarily. So church planting church does some preparation, forms partnerships, does it with others. Third main phase would be identify the church planter. From there, the planter starts the new work. The church is launched, and then the new church partners in planting the next church so that it's, lather, rinse, repeat, and everybody gets involved. So again, broad strokes, but Chris, what was your path and journey through all that?
Yeah. So like I said, I came from a church that did not have this in their DNA. Right. But we partner with a church that did, and that church designated a percentage of their budget every week to church planting. Right. And so for me, they were prepared. Right. They also had the partnerships in place that when they identified me, or I, we were friends. So I identified them as much as they identified me. They were 100% prepared to put me into a system, because basically when I was told you should start a church, I just laughed. And I was like, do people even do that? And honestly, like I was like, who the heck starts a church? And so for them, they really did set me up for a huge win, where I remember going through my residency and seeing the process. I mean, I started thinking, I was a youth pastor, college pastor, a couple hundred kids. Like, I know what I'm doing, vision statements. Like, I was like, I know what I'm doing. And then you realize, my goodness, there is a bajillion tasks, like the benevolence form, or policy. What do you do with, I'm like, well, I was a college pastor. I just got given a budget and I spend it. Like, well, you have to make the budget, and then how do you fit benevolence into it? So there's so many things, and that's where the planters, like for me, I started to have to think about this stuff, and so the work begins way before you open a door on a Sunday, right? I mean, you need to think your theology through, your bylaws, your leadership, your development, and then like you said, you launch your church, right? And as you launch it, naturally, you will be excited to help others launch their church as well. Like our church has helped 4 brand new churches blow out of the gates. And it's always funny when I'm like, you let me know if you need anything. I am there for you. And it's like, I'm still in startup phase, so I don't know if I'll have answers, but I will pray because it is hard. But my experience, that was it. I thank God that there was a mature church not doing it alone that had the steps in place that it took me from just raw preacher guy to like, I really do believe that our church survived COVID. Never had to lay off anyone. We never missed anything. But we kept going because of the preparedness and the plannedness that came from a prepared church sending us.
Patrick, there's not one set timeline for all those phases, but again, for a church that's listening to this, watching this, thinking about getting involved in their first plant, what's the window of time from first engagement to planting, minimum to max? It's 12 months to 3 years. It's like, what kind of time commitment is a church that's jumping in? Let's say collaboratively in this case. They're not doing it alone. They're jumping in with another group of churches.
Yeah, like you point out, it could be a little all over the map. And there's a variable of like how much has the church already done this? So the first time you're doing this, maybe it takes a little longer, and that's okay. That's how we learn things, right? Maybe the mature church that's planted over and over again can gain some efficiencies in that. But yeah, I mean, identifying the church planter and talking to all the partners, those are relational things that you can't always microwave, probably shouldn't microwave. And so, yeah, 9 to 12 months would be probably the short end of getting all of that ramped up to, all right, day number 1 of starting now the church planter is starting to plant the church. So that's not 12 months to get it open. It's 12 months to kind of get everything in place. Can take as much as. And then for the church plant process, depends a lot on the model, but you're probably looking at another 9 months to 18 months, depending. Again, lots of variables, but yeah, so you're looking at anywhere from year to 2.5 years, probably is a common time horizon for deciding, yeah, we want to get involved in church planting to seeing the grand opening of worship gatherings for that new church.
Yeah, let me jump in real quick, because I think a couple of things that I've learned, I've created this phrase, is how you start is how you'll end. Again, I haven't ended yet, so I'm not 100% sure this is like the perfect thought, but it seems like if you try to rush this thing, how you start, like we actually forgot our lighting system. So we actually were getting ready to open the week before, and we just forgot. It wasn't in the budget. I don't know why, but it just out of sight, out of mind. But it's funny how we limped along, like, with just a lighting rig forever. You didn't have the money for it. You spent it all on everything else. You know what I mean? And it's funny how, then you get into things we did do well, like generosity. Like, we decided we were going to give 10% of every dollar given to community outreach and church planting. And to this day, we call it our outreach fund or our planting fund. It's amazing how that has continued to just soar and be a part of our DNA. And so I'd say this is that you need to find a balance, because if you take too long, you create laziness in the planter and the planting team. If you do too quickly, you create frantic emergency type plants. So you want to land in the middle of what I would say urgency, right? Because for a planter, the things you struggle with in the beginning, or whatever you tried to shortcut, man, how you start is how you end, I feel like. Like, sometimes those things will be the reason you end it. And it's like, man, I wish I would have just planned that a little better, followed that. You know what I mean? So you got to find that balance. And again, it kind of goes back to find the planter, find your partners, the when and where, your accountability. I mean, when you nail those questions, then a lot starts to paint its picture for you.
That's really good. All right. You guys referred to that in the process of planting, there's a whole lot of things that this group of collaborative churches could do. It could be that one church would, handle bookkeeping for a while, and another church is providing some volunteers for a while. There's things that the collaborative churches themselves can do, but you also highlighted that there are some things that require special expertise that may or may not be provided by the church. So the question here is, what are the things, when you guys say there's some things that might take special expertise, what are those things?
Go ahead, Chris. Love to hear.
Yeah,
those
the
things that
beginning
you
of our journey.
experienced.
Yeah. The beginning of our journey was a church planter assessment. And again, it was the best experience of mine and my wife's life. So definitely church planting assessment is something to jump into, identify your planter, send them to do that. And again, there are some awesome ones. I went to Passion for Planting. Again, it was phenomenal, not just for the security of the sending churches, but for the planter. Me and my wife learned so much about ourselves and so much about who we are, why ministry works, the things that we were warned about, and saying, hey, these are things that will train wreck your church. They were right. And I thank God that it was there. So the assessment.
And hey, Chris, real quick, I don't mean to cut you off, but that would be an example then that assessments are available through third parties. Like there's proven assessments. In some ways, a collaborative of churches can just write a check to send somebody to assessment. But at the same time, in terms of learning, those same collaborative churches can go be part of the process of the assessment. They can go have a front row seat to it, learn it. And in the extreme, a church planting church could decide to become an assessment church. They could decide that's part of the distinctive. But this is an example where you don't have to have the expertise to do it. You can send a planter to an established thing.
Yep. Yeah. And that was our case. I mean, we got sent, and again, it was wonderful. And then the next thing I did, because remember I told you I didn't even know, I knew a lot about church, but had no idea how to start one. So I went to a residency. So I think that you're training, so I think you get assessment, figure out where you're at, and then get trained up. I did the residency program, and again, just so good, so valuable. Mine was a 9-month residency. So even go back to the timeline when you're looking at how long are you investing in it? I stayed doing my job at my local church while doing the residency for 9 months, right? So, and then after that, we then started our process of planting. Another thing that was so helpful was the plant project management. And again, I cannot overstate the importance of these things. Man, you need a project management software person. I had both. Patrick was my project manager and phenomenal. And I'm telling you, hey, we would sit down every week on calls, and he'd be just, I mean, he's like, because when you start a church, by the time you're like 3 months out, there are 15 switches that need to be turned on simultaneously. And if you don't have some way to organize those thoughts, man, it's a train wreck waiting to happen, but getting legal, getting your 501c3, a bank account, there's so many little tasks that is not why you as the planter or the church, you don't get into church planning to go, I want another bank account to manage. But that's a part of the process. You miss that, you miss it. So, and then, again, I think the last thing, and I still continue this to this day, is get coaching. Again, keeping people that know what they're doing around you, because again, as a church plant, you are going to go through a lot of seasons. I mean, ours was a little unique because we went through COVID, right? Probably more unique than everything else, but I'd be lying if I didn't say for the last 3 years, there's been just as many changes as COVID brought. I mean, it's wild how fast things can change, turn, the whole climate, everything. So to me, that's some specialization that I would definitely say, reach out, find organizations, find people. But those are things that I would say are the benchmarks of a successful church plant, that you need someone in your life or people in your planter's life to take them on this journey.
Yeah. I want to highlight, just to draw that part to a close, that I like to tell people that, the average church plant in America is comparable to building a house. When you look at what it takes to build a house, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. From start to finish, it's about 9 months. There's 400 to 600 things you have to do. They have to be done in a certain order. And if you think about it, you wouldn't turn your own money over to a general contractor who had never built a house before and wasn't ever trained in how to build a house.
Yeah.
And yet a church planter is like a general contractor with 6 to 9 months of hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend, with hundreds of tasks that all have to be done in a certain order. So when Chris is using the words project management here, he's talking someone's got to help the church planter with those hundreds of tasks that get organized into milestones and tasks, and there's a schedule and a budget that lays on top of it. And the good news is there are ministries and organizations like Passion for Planting that you don't have to be experts at it. There's groups that do it.
Yeah.
And so getting involved in church planting is actually much easier than people think. I like to say every church is really one decision away, and that's probably a financial commitment to planting. The rest of the things, the pieces come together. But as we wind down here to our last question, guys, what's your recommendation? You know, it could be a little overwhelming for a bunch of new churches to hear all these things. So if it's true that every church is one decision away from getting involved in church planting, what's your recommendation for how churches get started?
I would say just jump in. I mean, you look at the statistics, and 93% of churches in the U.S. are still not reproducing in any way, shape, or form, including even just tithing to church planting or putting some money into church planting. And so we have lots of room to grow as the church in the U.S., but a lot of churches are paralyzed by the someday win syndrome. You know, someday when we have enough money, or when we have the right people, or someday fill in the blank when, right? But that someday can be today. Decide to jump in and do something, ask around, start the inquiry, start wrestling through those important questions, because this is something that the kingdom needs, is something that our culture needs. And if I may be so bold, something that your congregation needs.
Yeah, and I'd add to it to speak directly to a pastor. And again, you can edit this out if this is inappropriate, but I look at it, how do you get going? It's the same way that you would pastor anyone to start tithing, right? There's a million reasons why you shouldn't, right? I can't afford it. I didn't plan. I did this. I did that. I don't have the resources. Well, what happens to my team? What happens? Everyone just takes it, look at you go through that all day long, but at the end of the day, you got to trust God that if you take the step and say yes, then he's going to meet you. And I promise, again, our little church has helped. We've given money. I've written checks to churches because we budgeted our money towards it. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of money. And I could buy my lighting rig for that much. But the point is we were like, you know what? The Lord is going to provide, and he has, right? And so I think, to me, just challenge yourself, man, jump in, do it. And I promise, like, you want to interact with the Holy Spirit and see God work, jump into the land of church planting, because I believe nothing pierces the darkness like the church, right? And if you want to see God move, you want to go up and talk about something to your church that's exciting, talk to them about you helped start a church, and I'm telling you, it will light you up, and it just moves the kingdom of God forward.
Well, guys, thank you. This is a blessing for churches that are looking to get involved in planting. I want to highlight right as we're getting off that this video, as well as the slide deck that goes with it, is available in the larger resource library for Multipliers Pathway. The QR code there will take you to a whole lot of resources on church planting and multiplication. The web address itself, if you don't do QR codes, is multipliers.org/MP/resources. And so you can grab it there on that QR code. Thanks again, guys, for joining in today.
Good to be here.
Yep. See ya.